but they're into your audio, which is great.
Right.
Our audience again is sort of I'm a corporate communicator. I went to Ryerson, took journalism, and kind of lived through your book a little bit here. But my audience is really sort of people who do communications, and not that you necessarily have to direct comments about that, but I hope that they kind of take from the conversation we have about you, the value that they're going to get. But just so you know that that's sort of the specific or segmented audience that we're sort of aiming at, and hopefully it goes beyond that. So,
Okay.
all right,
Let's rip.
we'll just go through here and get started. All right, well, it's a great pleasure to welcome someone who needs very little introduction to Canadians who've been keeping up with current affairs for the last 30 or 40 years. It's a great pleasure to welcome to the program former CBC chief correspondent and news anchor, and also a guy who you can keep up to date with news on his current podcast, The Bridge. Again, great pleasure to welcome to the Speaking of Media podcast from his home office in Stratford, Ontario, Mr. Peter Mansbridge. Hi, Peter, and welcome.
Keith, it's great to talk to you.
Peter, I received a very nice Christmas gift from my brother this year, and it happens to be your latest book, Off the Record, and I can certainly recommend that highly to my audience. I can tell you that I enjoyed reading it. I did read it, and I assume you wrote it to make reference to one of the stories you told about Margaret Thatcher in it. But anyhow, I kind of want to put our conversation around the book. As I was reading the book, and perhaps with the exception of the pandemic, I realized that it's been a sort of a long time since we've had an opportunity to really galvanize around a story as Canadians, either a triumph or a tragedy. What in your mind makes a great Canadian story?
Well, there are many. They great Canadian stories touch all the different emotions. They touch sadness, joy, heartache, heartbreak, our history. There's so many different great stories to tell. When I, hearing what you suggested at the beginning, that this has been one of the few that we've been able to galvanize around because of the pandemic. But I'm not sure I agree with that. I think there are many. There are many great Canadian stories that I can, name just from the, time I was in the business, and in fact, since I've left the business, in terms of doing the National every night, there are, great Canadian stories are the ones we determine to make great stories, and in the way we tell those stories. The whole nature of the relationship with between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, which keeps coming to the forefront in terms of the Canadian story, is one we shouldn't let go of, and one that we owe our citizens the right to explain that story as well as we can, from all perspectives. So I don't think there's any lack of stories to tell out there.
When I think of the Canadian perspective, maybe it's easier to sort of reveal, Canadiana when you're out in the world, and you certainly had plenty of experiences that you detailed in your book internationally. Did you maybe get opportunities that, maybe American counterparts or others internationally didn't get a shot at because you were Canadian?
I think so. I think that's fair to say. My American counterparts are covering a country that's a superpower, and they tend to look inward a lot. We tend to look outward. We see the world as a big place where we can have a contribution, but that we can learn from as well. One of the things about traveling the world and trying to understand the different agendas that are out there is that you end up learning a lot about yourself and about your own country from the way others react to it. And I think that was a big eye opener for me. We tend as Canadians, I think at times, not to be grateful enough for the country we have. And when you travel the world, you certainly see reason why we should be. because others don't have the same benefits that we have, and they know it, and they talk about it. And I saw that a lot in my international travels, and still do. So I think I think that's all a part of the story making business too, and the storytelling business is ensuring that we tell stories that talk about the difficulties we have as a country, but also focus a lot on the great things about the country.
I love your story about being discovered. I'd heard it many times before about being a baggage handler in Churchill, Manitoba. I can tell you that I started my journalism career in Dauphin, Manitoba, and you're where you are, and I am where I am. Maybe that's the it factor that you refer to in your book. But great to hear this.
Dauphin was like going to New York. When you lived in Churchill, Dauphin was the big city and one of the big cities in the South. So you had all kinds of benefits being in Dauphin that I never had in Churchill. I can tell you that.
Getting away to cottage country at Swan Lake and so on. So yeah. But anyhow, uh, what is it? Like you've gone through your career, you've had great successes and so on. You could have remained comfortable in Stratford, done what you wanted to. You could have golfed in Cruden Bay, a place where I've actually been. Your love for golf in the book is awesome. But what is it that drives you to continue to do your documentaries, your podcast on a regular basis, sharing and analyzing news? What is it essentially that drives you to keep wanting to do this?
Well, when I retired from the National, I never thought at that time that I was done. Like I was ready for a rocking chair on a porch somewhere. I always thought there were going to be more challenges ahead and more things to do. I never realized it would be as much as I'm doing. And at some point I will slow down, but when you're kind of writing books, doing a daily podcast, doing documentaries, hour-long documentaries for the CBC, sitting on a number of boards, teaching at, lecturing at the Monk School at U of T. There's a there's a lot of stuff there, but I find it, in spite of the fact there's a lot of stuff, I do it at my pace, and the way I want to do it. And that's been the beauty of this sort of post CBC life. I was at the CBC for 50 years. Don't regret a day of it. The CBC was great for me, and gave me all kinds of opportunities. Obviously, from the start, when you mentioned how I started and where I ended up. So obviously, there were a lot of opportunities there along the way. But it was ingrained in me from a very early age that if you were going to be interested in what goes on around you and to tell stories about what goes on around you, you should you've got to focus on that daily, and I still do. I mean, it's not like I chase fire engines anymore, but I hear them and I think about what they may mean, and I want to find out why they happen. But I love the work. It's all comes kind of naturally to me.
Yeah,
An inquisitive mind, of which many of us have, right?
absolutely. Yeah. So we share a love of sports, and unfortunately the Leafs too. But I bring that up because I want to talk a little bit about the mission of the public broadcaster. And I know that back in the day, when you were in the middle of it all, I understood and now have a better sense from your book that you didn't appreciate being sort of second fiddle for 2 months during the NHL playoffs. Was that a great example of money over mission when it came to the CBC?
Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, it was. I mean, I'm glad you pointed out that I am a sports fan and I love hockey. I'm a season ticket holder for the Leafs, so I've suffered along with them for a long time. But I think the CBC, as the national public broadcaster, at a time when there was no competition to broadcast hockey, I get it, but there is now, and the CBC allows 2 months of its schedule to be taken up by hockey, and I'm talking about during the playoffs, where it bounces the national all around if it even gets on some nights, and I just think that's obscene. It makes no sense at all for the national public broadcaster, of whom its number one um, reason for being is news and cultural news and information, news and current affairs. It's also very important for various cultural aspects of its broadcasting agenda, but sports, it shouldn't come at the expense of sports, especially when the CBC doesn't make a dime out of hockey anymore. They gave it away. Well, they didn't
Right.
give it away. Somebody else got the rights, but they give the airtime away.
Right.
And in return, they get to, run promos and commercials for for um, some of their programming, but they don't make any money on it.
Right.
And it's, I find it all very unfortunate. But I fought that battle for a long time when I was at the CBC. I had some victories on that front, but not a lot, and it's got a lot worse since I left. I mean, we're heading to the Olympics soon here
Right.
in China, and just like last year in Japan, it will totally bounce the national off the air on this main network of the CBC. It won't even be on the air, which is ridiculous. They say, well, it's okay. It's going to be on News Network. Well, sure, it is on News Network, and News Network does get an audience, a smaller, much smaller audience. But it's also not the public broadcaster. The CBC main network is. The News Network is a commercial network, just like all the other ones. I just think that's a bad corporate decision. But as I said, I've fought that battle for years, and I didn't win. So
You don't have to anymore. So even seeing the money spent on even the rights for the Olympics must have drove you wild, and thinking about how you could spend that money differently when it came to current affairs. But you do profile the Olympics in your book. The work that you did with Brian Williams and so on. Fascinating to hear those stories. Um, I guess always the opening and closing ceremonies are a time when you can kind of talk about it. The world coming together and sort of the effect that the Olympics has on the world. What's your sense of where the Olympics are going? Is that going to sustain through our lifetime? The IOC certainly, has lost its shine, especially with the pandemic and the games coming up again. What's your sense of the Olympics moving forward?
I hope some form of the Olympics is always with us, because it is one of those great world gathering moments. And, and the athletes who take part in it, aren't the political leaders who tend to fight over, any number of different issues on a constant basis. But the athletes are there to perform as well as they can in the challenge of their lifetimes, and it's fun to watch. So I've never felt anything negative towards the Olympics from that sense. I do think that, just like everything else, things are changing. The landscape of television has changed considerably, and journalism is facing its various challenges, and the Olympics will too. From drugs to the power of money in the Olympic movement, to the constant changing of the basic sporting venues that take place. All these things are challenges, not only to the heart of what the Olympic movement is supposed to be about, but also to the challenge of trying to make enough money to pay for these extraordinary, expensive games that take place every couple of years.
Yeah. Just before we get off sort of the CBC mission story, how do you view the coverage of the pandemic? And from a public broadcaster point of view, is there a sense that obviously you need to be critiquing the government and leaders in this kinds of situation, but is there sort of a sense of, not to the point of being a state broadcaster, but that you need to be part of the channel or mechanism for getting the word out on how this is operating and what citizens' responsibilities are in such a situation?
Don't take this personally, but I find that insulting,
Okay.
that anybody would even think that way. because we're journalists. We're not flunkies and toadies who work for whatever government's in power. It's a public broadcaster. It doesn't mean it's owned by the party in power or the government in power. It's owned by the people of Canada, and that's where the duty is too, especially in terms of news and current affairs. So you're challenging assumptions, whether they're being made by the party in power or the party in opposition. You're doing your business of trying to inform the public of the issues of the day. So, you know, there was one time in the history, you know, the modern history of the CBC, and that was 1970 during the Quebec crisis, where the government, you know, basically played the CBC on the way it wanted to in terms of forcing it to do certain things on air. And that was a terrible moment. I mean, I was a very junior member of CBC News at that time, and I wasn't involved. I was still in Churchill, but the reverberations of that moment lasted a long time, and the leadership has been determined ever since that they would never allow anything like that to happen again. And certainly during my time, it never did. So there's a challenge in front of all journalists during this pandemic, as there have been in other big issues, to tell the truth, to be as much as you can ahead of the story in informing Canadians of what's going on. And it's no different now than it's ever been or is on any other story.
Just a devil's advocate question to allow you to iterate that, so I appreciate that. So let's talk about political power. The prime ministers. I loved your chapters on John Turner and on Jean Chrétien. I'm gonna sort of focus on Brian Mulroney. So he was notorious for being the great networker when he came onto the scene, and I think beyond that. And I've actually heard individuals relate anecdotes to me where he would reach out and sort of do these grand personal gestures. The experience that you relate in the book is when he won the leadership. Were there other times when Mulroney sort of surprised you and was maybe different than his personal or public persona in a very personal way?
Yeah, listen, I covered Mulroney for a long time, and I still have conversations with him today. We've done a couple of events together, but all our times together haven't all been cordial. We've crossed swords more than a few times on different issues, whether it was Airbus or free trade or Meech Lake or you name it. There have been lots of times, but I found him one way personally and another way, especially during his time in office, where he seemed to be a very different person. You were sitting across from in an interview than you would be if the cameras weren't rolling. Right. And that's unfortunate with anybody. And, to some extent, there are a lot of people who you end up interviewing with, not just in politics, who are like that. They put on a certain air for the interview situation, which isn't necessarily their natural air.
Right.
But he's an incredibly engaging guy. I mean, that's why he won the biggest majority in the history of the country in '84, and won another majority 4 years later, which there are very few politicians in our country who've won back-to-back majorities. He's one of them. Now, he got basically run out of town after that second majority, and it's taken him a long time for a variety of different reasons to build his reputation back, but it's back on a lot of levels, and he's regarded as as one of the country's great prime ministers.
So covering politics, so much has changed on Parliament Hill, especially those who are covering it. And I have to tip my hat to CBC and other outlets. Diversity is coming, and we're seeing new faces and people with different backgrounds starting to cover Parliament Hill and reflecting it back to Canadians. It's been a long time since, you and, Messrs. Halton and Stewart and Newman and Moskovitz were covering the Hill. Do you believe that, in respect to those guys, mostly older white guys, do you believe that different faces bring different perspectives to the political story in the country?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, even with us white guys, when I came into the Ottawa bureau in 1976, uh, I was 28 years old. The different perspective then was, even though we were all white and we were all male, the different perspective was we were a new wave of young guys. Myself and Mark Phillips and John Blackstone, and there were a bunch of us back then. Even Duffy. We were all young, and we broke the mold of the sort of older white guy who was on the Hill. Until we became the older white guys. But since then, I mean, so much has changed. First of all, it was the number of women who came into the business, and not just in front of the camera, but behind the camera and in the management of the place, to the point now where, I mean, I don't know the actual numbers, but I would suggest that there are more women in positions of power at the CBC in the news section, current affairs section, than there are men. But it's moved more than just obviously men and women. There's a much better reflection, still not enough in my view, but a much better reflection of the true nature of the country. That when you walk into a newsroom at the CBC these days, it looks more like the country you're living in than it did even a few years ago. I'd like to see that same kind of reflection in management and at the senior positions in the CBC than exists now. But it's heading, as you said, it's heading in that direction, and the change has been substantial over the last 50 years. In terms of gender, the last 20 years in terms of diversity beyond gender.
We spoke to Kevin Newman in a previous episode, and we were talking about the news networks in the States, and he refers to them as opinion networks, not so much news networks. You chose to stay in Canada when you had the choice. You must feel like that was a great choice, and a great story in your book about the generosity between Knowlton Nash and yourself when push came to shove to decide whether or not you were going to stay in the country.
Yeah, I mean, just to back up a bit, I'm not sure what Kevin said to you, and Kevin's a friend, but I wouldn't agree that, some of the cable news operations are definitely opinion, primarily in the evening,
Right.
not during the daytime, but primarily in the evening when the bigger audiences exist. And they've determined, I guess, rightly or wrongly, that you'll get bigger audiences with strongly worded opinion. But you should probably stop calling it a news channel at night. Just call it that during the day.
Right.
The main networks are still, pretty rock solid in terms of their journalism for like the evening newscasts at 6:30 in the States, and some of their, major current affairs programs. Would be wrong to call them opinion.
Right.
I'm very comfortable with the decision I made, and that's no knock on the American networks or on the people who chose to go to the States and work there for a year or two, or as in Kevin's case, or longer, as there have been in many of my different colleagues over the years have done that. But I'm comfortable with the decision I made because the CBC is unlike anything else. It's not a private network. It should not have those kind of constraints on it, and I say that carefully. That the privates do in terms of money, but the time it affords to doing longer form journalism is really important. And if that's not what we do, and if even when we do it, it's not seen as special, then it makes the argument for the CBC even harder to make. CBC has to be different. It has to look different. It has to sound different, and it has to act differently. If it doesn't, then why are the Canadian public spending more than $1 billion a year on it? It's a legitimate question.
Absolutely. I loved your reference to Jeffrey Simpson and his thoughts around sort of bullshit over brains. How important is it, and it continues to be, I think, because you do it with the likes of Chantal Hébert and so on, how important is it to complement what broadcast journalists are doing with print journalists? Is that something that's going to carry on, and is that a necessity when it comes to analyzing news in a broadcast environment?
Well, there's obviously room in the business of journalism for opinion, and print has always had that ability to have opinion makers and opinion leaders in their columnists, and they separate daily news from their columnists. And Chantal, who I've known for 30 years, is one of the best, if not the best, political commentator in the country. And so I've always wanted to have the ability to be able to talk to her, and I still do today because she's a weekly guest on my podcast, and it's great to have her. But I think it's really important to understand that there has to be this dividing line between news and opinion. And that's usually the dividing line between news and current affairs. And the old days of, the National and the Journal 40 years ago now, the National was the news. And when the National ended at 22 minutes after the hour and the Journal started, it was more likely to be opinion or point of view pieces. And that was fine. There was a dividing line. You understood it. It's when the two start to kind of crowd each other, and news becomes more opinion driven, that that I think you're failing your audience. People aren't stupid. They don't need to be told what to do, and they would like to make up their own minds about things. And that's that's the structure of doing a newscast. You give them the facts, just the facts, and let them decide for themselves. And then they can be influenced by listening to others' opinions, and that's fine, but that's separated from the actual news.
This is great stuff, and I still have a few more questions. I'm cognizant of our time, but I wanted to get a little bit of a flavor for what you're offering in your book. So the whole idea around what used to be sort of show pressures, and it may have changed over the years. I can remember when I went to Ryerson, the late Stuart McLean was my instructor and mentor, and he graciously sent me up to watch the National get put together a few times. I sat on the desk and watched your friend Mark Bulgotch put it together. It was fascinating to see, and you relate some great stories about sort of last minuteness and the way that you operated. And then we look at today's National. How do you feel about being replaced by multiple people as opposed to sort of carrying on, as CTV has done, with sort of a lead correspondent as sort of the face of the news?
Yeah, I have, I have divided opinions on that. First of all the people who are, I'm still a huge fan of the journalists of the CBC, all of them. Some are still, good friends of mine. I'm more of a traditionalist. I've never been a fan of multiple hosts. I've never seen it work ever at a network level. It works locally. But at a network level, you've got to go back to, Huntley Brinkley in the 60s. And, it wasn't the leading newscast of its day. But ever since then, every time they've tried to do, even two hosts, it hasn't worked. ABC tried three hosts at one point in the 80s. That didn't work. They're all single hosts again now. You go around the world and look at some of the great newscasts and public broadcaster newscasts, and they're single hosts.
Right.
And I've always felt that was the best way to go on a network newscast, because people will look for a certain degree of continuity and they build up a trust factor with, one anchor. Um, but as I said, I'm a traditionalist, and maybe I'm just from the old school. I know that all networks, including the CBC, are trying to figure out what the landscape is going to be in the news business. And it's tough to determine that, because everybody suffered some degree of audience loss, because simply the world has expanded and people use different tools to gather their information. I mean, young people, they're not watching television like we used to watch television.
Mm.
They're all on their phones, and that's
Right.
where they gain their information. That's where they gain a lot of the crap that's out there too.
Right.
But still, it's a challenging time. And so I have sympathy for, network executives and news leaders who are trying to determine what's the best way to move forward in this new age. And it's not easy. And it's especially not easy at a time when you make a transition, when you go from, one person who's been there for a long time and has a certain relationship with the audience, to
Yes.
suddenly they're gone and they're replaced by one person or a number of people. And you have to kind of build your audience again. And in television, you can lose an audience overnight.
Yeah.
It can take years to get it back again.
Yeah. My
If,
sense is that,
if ever.
Adrienne Arsenault does really well in the field, and she's an awesome war and international correspondent. And it's is she so good that she's
She
the
could be
best
working
face?
anywhere. She could be working anywhere in the world. She's a terrific journalist,
Yeah.
and I'm a huge fan of hers. Have been since she used to be, since when she was first hired and was working in the newsroom in Toronto. She used to bring the copy into me when I was sitting at the news desk at the National. So I mean, she's been around a long time. She knows a lot of stuff, and she's a great writer, great storyteller, terrific journalist.
So one question I'll ask, just that you've been generous with your time, I just kind of want to maybe wrap up with that I often ask the question of guests who have the experience, and maybe your experience now is evolving as you're into these new platforms and so on. But advice around young people trying to still get into the kind of work that you do when they're being told that journalism school maybe is or isn't worth your while or whatever, and maybe you don't need journalism school. You were able to find a niche and find a way to build your career in a spectacular way. But what kinds of things do you tell people when they're asking you about the possibilities of storytelling in this sort of new world?
Well, there's always going to be a need for storytellers and good storytellers, and you get the best training and understanding by going to a good journalism school and searching out the best, professors, instructors, teachers. Um, that's where you're going to get the ground floor of the training you need. And I wish I'd had that. I didn't. I was in a different time. I mean, journalism schools weren't a big deal in the 60s. That really started post Watergate, when everybody wanted to be a journalist all of a sudden.
Hmm.
And the reason I got the job when I started out of the baggage handling business was because nobody else wanted it. Like literally nobody else wanted it. And they offered it to me because they liked the sound of my voice. And that's how I started. And then I had to, by myself, layer on an understanding of what the business is really all about and how to do it. And I used to sit there for hours every day on my own time, listening to shortwave radio, listening to the way other people did it, not copying them, but just trying to understand how they went about interviews, how they went about editing, how they went about announcing, how they went about storytelling. And so I kind of forced a transparency on their part by listening to them of how they do their work. And it's one of the challenges for journalism today at a time when there's decreasing credibility between the journalists and their audience, is to be more transparent about how we do our work, how we decide what's news and what isn't, you know, all of the things, all of the questions that people have about news in today's world. And there are many questions about how we do our work. We have to be able to answer up front and directly, or we're going to be in serious trouble in the years to come.
Well, great themes to reference and chime in on. Transparency and storytelling are a big part of what we talk about here on this podcast, and you've certainly been a grand storyteller of so many of us through the years, and so appreciative. Not sure we'll get a chance to ring you up again, so I just want to thank you for being fascinating to me and to your audiences over the years, and allowing us to peer into your professional world as you saw it. It was a great read, and I certainly, like I say, recommend people get your book. We'll put a reference up there for where people can reach your podcast, and we'll tell them where they can buy the book if they want. And thanks again, Peter, for taking the time and sharing your stories with us.
Well, thank you, Keith. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Awesome. And could I just bother you for one more thing, Peter? Would you mind just looking to camera and just saying, hi, I'm Peter Mansbridge, and I enjoyed Speaking of Media with Keith Marnoch. I have to just put you on the, just give you, would you mind doing that?
Oh, not at all. Here we go.
I'll give you a second. Okay. Oh, sorry. Just give it 2 seconds because it has to change to your thing when I stop talking. Okay.
Hello there. I'm Peter Mansbridge. I enjoyed Talking Media with Keith Marnoch. Hope you listen.
Awesome. Can you just do it one more time? So it's Speaking of Media, just so we get the reference right.
Yeah. Hi there. I'm Peter Mansbridge. I want you to know how much I enjoyed Speaking of Media with Keith Marnoch.
Beautiful. Love working with professionals. That's great. Really much appreciate that, Peter. And I'll let you know when it's going on. I'm probably going to be putting this out next week, and I'll send you a note as well as to your publicist, and thank her for connecting us. And good luck with the book. And thanks again for doing this.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
All the best. Stay well.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye now.